Welcome everyone to MegaCon Day 2. First up we have Alex, who's on screen now. He works for the British Civil Service and he is the chair of the Civil Service Fast Stream Wargaming Network. That's a mouthful to say at 11 o'clock in the morning. And Alex is going to provide his experiences of going from a hobby megagamer to a professional wargamer. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Chris. So thank you for having me, everyone. I had a big think about what to do in this hour because I've never actually kind of given a presentation to a Megagame conference before, maybe because they haven't existed before, but, you know, excuses and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to meander through kind of what wargaming is like in the workplace, why you would even consider doing it in the workplace, and then throw in some thoughts about if you are currently involved in the megagaming or hobbyist wargaming community and have an interest in exploring this professionally, what should you be doing? I was actually thinking about this about 5 minutes ago, and the first slide I've got here was a definition of wargaming, but this is the megagaming conference, so I feel like while I'm going to go and talk about definition of wargaming, I'll leave it to Chris to post a definition of megagaming in the chat so we all know what we're talking about. So thank you very much for the help, Chris.
Thanks, Alex.
And onwards we go. So wargaming. So what is it? Particularly in the workplace, like isn't wargaming the thing that we do with the little model tanks and the kind of the big board? And the answer is no. Megagaming, wargaming even, is a very specialist tool that policymakers, you know, either in government, in business, you know, anyone who's trying to think through what's going on and how it works might be able to use to really understand complex problems. Now, it's got a very long and rich history in the world of security and defense, but I appreciate that in the big world of kind of business and everything, not very many people are actually working in the security and defense industry, but genuinely it can be used in lots of different places, from humanitarian work to business to kind of normal kind of day-to-day politics. And I'll touch on some of the examples of how that is kind of used as the presentation goes on. But for the purpose of this talk, wargaming is the process of simulating a situation where the actions of two or more actors working against each other change the ultimate outcome. So it is any place where there's at least two different people or groups that are working at odds from each other and thus creating a complex situation that we want to understand if we are to kind of answer problems around it. So that's the definition of wargaming right there. A lot of people, when I talk about wargaming in the workplace, I work in the civil service, big thing, like 500,000 civil servants. There's a very small cadre of people who kind of understand why do we use it, and there's lots and lots and lots of people who would kind of assume it's a board game and things. But I always kind of ask people, like, when we're playing on board games, when we're actually doing things that we want to do, like we're trying to achieve things, we're trying to achieve objectives. And actually, you know, if you're playing something like a Megagames, you're probably very passionate about achieving objectives and winning. And is that not what we're trying to do kind of at work? Aren't we trying to at least achieve the things that our organizations are setting out to do? Like, is there such a big gulf between them? Like, if you're thinking about things strategically on a board game and you're not thinking about things strategically at work, then that seems to me to be a bit of a mismatch. You know, there's very similar mindsets that you can apply in both situations. There's a lot of overlap, and that kind of thought about strategy and dealing with people has at least been very helpful for me during my career. So this is one of the reasons why I think wargaming is a fantastic thing to be exploring in certain situations in the workplace. So, like, actually, what is a wargame? And the answer is that there is no solid definition of a wargame, as there is no solid definition of a megagame, because they're very malleable. You know, the definition I gave earlier of like simulating any situation where there's two or more people entering conflict with each other, that can apply to lots of different things, and you can explore it in lots of different ways. Everything from, like, you know, going into a room and just having a discussion with somebody else about what you think a third person is going to do, to like massive scenarios where like all the forces in NATO are coming together for joint exercises to kind of really run through like very specific challenges that we are going to face as alliances of nations. You know, the very different, like distinct scales of what wargaming could be make it very hard to nail down. But they all have, I think, some common characteristics. And this is what I'm going to try and bring to life in this session. So wargaming is any time when you run through kind of a situation where people involved in that situation will have to make choices and live with them. So anytime there is a narrative, anytime that there is action and counter-reaction, I think it is possible to wargame it in some capacity. Now, the narrative of the situation must be changed by those decisions. So there's many cases where we make assumptions in a workplace. This is what we think, this is how we think the world works, and stuff like this. If you run into trying to analyze the situation, but allow the assumptions the organization has to decide the outcome, so thus you can't actually do anything, you have to just play through kind of the script that you've been given, that's not a war game. That's not going to be helpful to getting some understanding of the situation. You need to have the opportunity to open yourself up to choices that people make while you're doing the war game to change the ultimate narrative of it. So you can explore kind of different threads, that people can do the things that are not done, explore the ideas that are not explored in your organization. And that itself opens up a lot of doors to interesting analysis and interesting conversations. And finally, other participants have to be able to react to those decisions. Like, you genuinely need to have at least 2 different people here who are able to react honestly to each other. So, if you have a very senior boss come in and, they just expect things to work as they say it'll work, that's not a war game. That will not open doors. You need to have a space where people can share ideas with each other. And once they can do that, once they can challenge each other, once they can kind of react to each other's moves through whatever system you have in place, then you might have what you might call a workplace war game. So war games, they're really good at drawing part like lots of complex bits of scenarios and working through them where people are making choices and reacting to each other, and then you can see and talk about those reactions, which is where a lot of the value comes from. But just like Megagames, your exact definition is extremely hard to nail down because they can look like so many different things. Why do it? Like, okay, fine. So I can do a really complex thing that no one can quite define. That means I can go through a narrative with a couple of people. But why do it? Why would workplace gain value from warped gaming? Analysis and discussion is really critical to understanding issues. And war games are brilliant for producing kind of narratives that you can take away. You can have conversations with people. You can test the assumptions they were making. Like, I think I was listening to a talk the other week on how we were effectively able to understand the motives and actions of senior leaders in particular. And I think the argument that they are making was that it's very, very difficult to get the true actions that someone would take just from asking them straight up, what would you do in this situation? Because there's a lot of acceptable answers that you can get given. But put that in that situation, and suddenly, once they have to actually balance up the risks, the different priorities they have, you will see what they might be able to, what they might actually do if that situation was to happen in real life. So if I was going to ask you, like, would you hire or fire someone in this situation? And someone would be like, of course I'd hire somebody. I'm not going to just tell people I'm about to fire people. But then if you run through the situation and say, here's your resources, here's the risks, here's what you need to do, and here's the people you've got, you'll then see what behaviors they'll do to try and fit the team they've been given at the beginning into meeting the needs they've got there. So there is a lot of value in making people run through a scenario and then having a conversation about the choices they made in it, because that will give you a very different insight to just talking to them and asking them questions straight up. Now, if you're doing wargaming, never try and do it for hard numbers. Never try and say, I need to work out exactly how many, iotas of fuel I'll need, or how many people I'll need, or how much kind of money I need to invest in a project to make it work. Wargaming is good for generalities. It's good for kind of opening up assumptions and analyzing them, but it's not at all good for producing a hard number at the end of the day that you can use in a useful fashion. There's other very different models that you can use, like statistics, simulation, like actual modeling and things that are better for hard numbers. So this is not the thing to explore for that. But it is fantastic for education. And this is like one of the places where you see it really effective in the workplace. If you're trying to make someone understand a challenge that you've got, you can send them like a 5-page briefing pack full of lots of words that they may skim through, or you might take them away for half a day, run them through a game based around your scenario, your challenge, make them kind of live it, make them breathe it, and then they will come away with a much greater appreciation of the challenges you're facing and the things you might have to do as an organization to solve them. And I'll have some examples of some good educational games later on in this presentation. So what value can we get out of wargaming in the workplace? The first, I think, is motivation. You're pulling a team of people together to actually run through scenarios before they happen is a really good way of team building. It's a really good way of getting people to know what they are like, each other are like in kind of situations where you're kind of imitating something that might actually happen. Team meetings where everyone sits around a table and just talks to each other are one thing, but you put everyone through a scenario together and you'll get a different kind of camaraderie at the end. So fantastic for kind of bringing people together. Skills. So a lot of things that we do, particularly if we're like in office-y based jobs, are far away from like the actual kind of front lines of whatever organization that we're doing. If you go to a learning and development session, you might learn something once. You might go once a year to a kind of like team building session where you learn how to build teams. But actually mastering skills requires repetition. It requires doing a similar thing lots of times before you really understand it and really become like an adept user of it. Wargaming allows you to build like situations where you can trial run things multiple times and kind of build up skill base of whatever you're trying to get your heads around and actually see what it's like live, which is a brilliant way of kind of getting people kind of trained up in a bit more a routine, reliable way than just doing a one-off training session once a year on whatever you're trying to learn. And there's a lot of generalities here because I appreciate like all the organizations that we work at are very different. So in government, there's a lots of like, we're trying to figure out how hospitals work. We're trying to figure out about how to effectively build schools. We're trying to figure out exactly like what the international relations we're dealing with other countries are. All of those very different. And so all of them have different like scenarios and challenges that we're trying to get our people good at. But the key thing is that we want people to be really comfortable in the areas they're working in, comfortable to kind of really open up and challenge kind of ideas that we've got. And so this is a really good flexible tool if you have good people who can design a game that can fit the situation that you're trying to get your heads around at your workplace. A third thing that's really good about wargaming in the workplace is networks. So, bringing other teams in or bringing in senior people. There's lots of glitz to inviting people to a war game. It's a very fun and sexy thing. And that actually gets people kind of on board much better than, threatening them with like a 2-hour briefing where you lecture at them. So this is kind of like similar to the motivation point where it's kind of bringing people together, but it's really good for kind of opening up and having conversations and bringing other teams in that you wouldn't usually work with. And then actually having kind of a very intense session with them can lead to a much stronger working relationship in the long term than, grabbing coffee once a year would. So really good for building networks. And finally, if you're wargaming, you've got processes and things in place where you guys are trying to explore. So, this is the thing that we're going to wargame, and this is how our organization works. And actually simulating these things can reveal places where your processes aren't really up to scratch, where perhaps you don't have enough support in place, or perhaps you've got a lot of stuff that is redundant and things. Like actually seeing the machine kind of working and moving is much better than just trying to get people to visualize how a complex organization of hundreds of people work in their heads to try and identify places where changes could be made to support everyone. So it's really good at kind of testing processes. So like a little bit of a slide I grabbed from another presentation I saw a couple of weeks ago. This is wargaming in the humanitarian sector. And from their numbers, and I'll leave them to justify exactly how reliable these numbers are, a lot of their games, about 85% of them, were about kind of raising awareness, that educational point, getting people they wanted to understand the humanitarian crisis they were facing, to kind of live through the crises for a day in a simulation, and then come away with much greater appreciation of the challenges that they were facing. 15% or so were about getting their own teams kind of skilled up in the area to make sure that those teams were able to actually do the support for whatever they were prescribed to be doing, be it kind of coordinating food packages or actually kind of working with agencies getting kind of flood defenses up or whatever the humanitarian work was. And about a very small number were around actually trying to analyze the situation and kind of really delve into it. Because in the humanitarian sector, I think there was a bit of nervousness about trying to understand very human issues through the medium of serious games. Now, different sectors have different approaches to this. So in government, there's a lot more on the analysis section, because we've got lots of complex problems, and we really need to get our heads around lots of moving parts, particularly nowadays as the world is getting very complicated indeed. But just to give you a flavour, there's very different roles these war games can play in the workplace. Now, what other tools would you use wargaming alongside, or what are the alternatives? So I've just kind of grabbed a couple that kind of have come up repeatedly. Workshops, let's do a workshop on it. Workshops are as ambiguous as like Megagaming and Wargaming. There is no definition. A workshop can be utterly fantastic with excellent facilitators really diving into an issue, or a workshop can be your 3 hours of your life put into a small room with nobody really knowing what's going on or having a lead on it, trying to have like a one-on-one conversation with 100 people involved. They can go from the terrible to the excellent, just as a mega game or war game can. But on broadly, they're the generic thing that you do if you want to just try and understand something at the moment. You get people in the room, you get people to talk about it. If it's run badly, then everyone will likely be wasting a lot of time. But if it's run really well, if you get some specialists in to kind of talk people through and run some activities, they can be quite vibrant and quite useful. Now, wargaming basically adds a lot of structure, whatever the game design is, to a workshop, and basically allows there to be a big central narrative that you run through, and which allows people to kind of delve more deeply into a situation. By having a common agreed rule set, a common agreed game design, people are free to go off script and force others to react to that, thus gaining a greater understanding of the situation. So, some war games could just be really fancy workshops with some of our wargaming kind of methodology involved in them. But as long as you're aiming to produce a narrative that you can discuss and explore after the fact, then they can usually have a lot better impact than just running just a generic workshop with post-it notes. Simulations. So, these things are when we've got a computer system that is kind of programmed up to do whatever we want to do, to simulate an actual situation happening or an actual problem that we want to solve. Now, these simulations can be fantastic, but they're usually extremely expensive. A good mega game designer can hash out a design for a problem in hour or two. Like building a simulation to simulate a problem will take weeks, days, and months. There's a lot of challenges with building good simulations. You need a lot of specialist skills to do so. Once it's built, it's a bit of a black box, and only the people who've built it kind of really understand what it's doing under the hood. But if designed well with the correct expertise, you can get a hard number at the end of a simulation that might be able to tell you exactly what you need in quantities or something like that to achieve your intended outcome. Wargaming is a lot more kind of by the seat of our pants. We have designed things that are a bit more abstract. There's can be some computer sciencey bits involved if you are a really fancy person who's got a really big budget. But on the whole, it's more about exploring ideas, opening up conversations, and innovating, and much less about kind of that hard numbers than simulations. And then exercises. Now, exercises are when you get people to actually do the thing in real life. So if you're wargaming, like an aircraft carrier, like sailing around, then you've got a big table where you've got one aircraft carrier maybe, where you're making it sail around. But if you're doing an exercise, you need to have an actual aircraft carrier with, 5,000 people, 15 planes, X number of fuel, like barrels, etc. Like getting your stuff out and actually, doing it in real life in an exercise is extremely expensive. Now, you're going to get the best appreciation of how things work when you actually do an exercise of them, because you're actually going to see them work, and you can be actually pointed and said, that aircraft carrier sunk, we now have one less aircraft carrier, we should fix that. When in the wargaming kind of situation, because it's so abstract and things, no matter how good the game design is, you're never going to get to that level of understanding of actually making people do things. But I can get 3 people into a room to wargame a challenge, which might involve like battalions, and I don't actually need battalions to kind of go around a big field and do the thing that I'm trying to wargame. So it's so much cheaper, so much more kind of easy to amend on the fly, and requires so many less people involved that there's a real value in understanding it. And then how many of us actually work in situations in organizations which require kind of like big amounts of manpower moving around, where an exercise might be appropriate to kind of test out. So yes, wargaming. sits somewhere between all these different ways of understanding problems. It brings its own kind of challenges, but it brings a lot of really positive and powerful impacts that can really help your organization understand. You need to have really good kind of facilitators to make a wargame function, particularly with people who aren't so familiar with the kind of concept. So there is a big challenge there. And then once you've kind of done it and produced a narrative, then you need to have really good ways of discussing and making sure you get value out of that narrative. There's lots of kind of conversations in the community at the moment. You know, if you have a good answer to that and you know how to get like a certain kind of value out of a war game, it might be completely different from the value some other people might get out of it. But you could have a very good career in wargaming by coming up with good ideas on how to best take advantage of these kind of engines. Yes, wargaming, it is a very interesting kind of tool itself. This might be for a different presentation, so I apologize, everyone. So, like, why would you wargame? So crowds are really good at helping people understand problems. Like if you are sitting in your office at the moment, you might think, you know, the boss kind of makes some decisions. Exactly what assumptions are they making? Like, am I able to express my views? Like, I've got some expertise here, but whenever the decisions are made around the area of work, I'm not really considered. We want to get crowds involved in decision making in organizations because that leads to better decisions. And organizations that don't actually take advantage of this are the kind of organizations that are really losing out at the moment because the world is just moving a bit too quickly for kind of the old ways of working. Why are groups fantastic about making decisions in the workplace? Diversity is like the big thing. If there's any sort of diversity, if it's age, gender, background, ethnicity, that will lead to different perspectives in the room, flagging different challenges, particularly if your organization is responsible for interacting with the community at large, then you know the community is made up of very diverse people, and understanding their perspectives, understanding the challenges and reaching out to them is a very important way of making sure that the decisions you're making in your organization are like founded, they're accurate, and they're actually able to be accessible to people. So bringing in big groups to make these decisions is really important because of that. The decentralization of expertise. So, you know, sometimes you rely on one expert to make decisions in a workplace. But the problem with that is humans are fallible, you know, no matter how expert they are. You know, we can come with some strange assumptions, you know, or we can just be sick and have a bad day. You know, relying on one person to be kind of your smart brain box means that if that one person is ever doing something that is less than effective, then you're doomed to be beholden to the kind of them. You know, your fate is tied to theirs. You get a lot of people kind of contributing to conversations. You kind of add to the resilience because you remove that weakness of being attached to a single person who's making decisions. So, you know, decentralization of expertise brings more capacity in. You know, I don't know about you, but work is, I find work to be very busy at times. My brain is often full of different things. More brains on a problem means I can actually spend more time thinking about it and less time just trying to make the basics work. So it's really good to do. Independence of thought. So it's really important when you're considering at the moment, we're in territory that we've never been in before. Like we've just gone through a pandemic. No one was prepared for a pandemic like a year ago. Actually, a year ago was when it kind of kicked off, which is so strange. It's been going on for so long. Yes, no one was particularly like prepared for it when it kicked off. So like the way our organizations work at the moment, like nobody knows the right answer. Nobody knows the effective ways of doing it. You know, we're all still working from home, or at least most of us are. You know, we're all still trying to use new technologies to try and work in the workplace. And when we go back, it will not be the same as the place that we left more than a year ago. So like if anyone pretends they have the answers of how to effectively make the organization function at the moment, then fair play to that person, but I would be very dubious indeed. Having lots of people contributing with their own perspectives, bringing new ideas in, that independence of thought can help navigate these challenges, particularly because I know my organization, the civil service can be very hierarchical, and a lot of these decisions are made by people who, you know, don't really know how, you know, Zoom or Microsoft Teams even works. You know, there's a big technological and skills divide between like older decision makers and younger junior civil servants who kind of grew up with digital technologies. So, you know, if all decisions are made up there, you lead to some very strange situations indeed. For instance, like half the government departments can't really talk to the other half at the moment because they use different kind of meeting systems, because nobody thought that would be an issue. But now that we're working digitally, that's become kind of a huge roadblock to kind of working together. And so like bringing in people with different skills and backgrounds really helps solve that problem. And finally, like if you have a room full of people who are fairly clued up on something, then if you aggregate their views, you could probably get the gut feeling of the room, and that will probably be a fairly good, reliable indicator of what's going to happen. So if you've got 10 people and 6 of them think, probably we all know the area and it's going to do this thing, then they probably have a fairly good shot of being right because you aggregated the result. So getting crowds involved in exploring challenges is a really good way of fixing problems, and wargaming gives a really good way of doing that because you kind of have a structured space where people have gone in, they kind of know their roles, they know that it's a space where they can be kind of forthright, they can challenge existing assumptions, and then there's also a little bit where you see kind of junior members of the staff with the opportunity to kind of really show off exactly how bright and brilliant they can be, like producing some excellent results. But too much communication can erode these advantages. So crowds can be dire. Groupthink, it exists. We've probably all encountered it. Hierarchy makes itself known in any situation, giving views excess weight, and meaning that if one person's assumptions that were very valid 30 years ago, but maybe less valid now, suddenly are still dictating the direction of the organization. You might be talked out of your good idea or your good gut feeling because you just see the majority going another way. Like people don't like being on the losing side. And so like being in an environment where you're just kind of asking people like, what do we all think? And then having like a really long extended conversation without the structures of a war game can lead to kind of this groupthink kicking in when we're uncomfortable in a situation with challenging different people's views, then it's very easy for like kind of group to be captured by something for reasons apart from being the right answer. So your organization it might have a long and like illustrious history, but that means assumptions can be baked in that could be completely wrong in this day and age. Blockbuster went down with its ship because it could never really get its head around moving to digital because it was just assuming business model would forever kind of last. Actually getting away from those situations where you're getting away from that groupthink is really hard, and so creating environments where you're specifically trying to do so is a really kind of powerful thing to do. And finally, we're all human. We have emotions. We can be subject to peer pressure. So wargaming provides a structured forum to get away from this groupthink and creates a rank neutral space if facilitated effectively to where a lot of these kind of issues can be worked through. Now, the strength of the war game is dependent on the skills of the team running it. As with anything, if it's run badly, it can lead to ineffective results. But you guys are all at MegaCon, so I'm going to assume you're all brilliant geniuses at designing and playing games, and so your expertise would be absolutely invaluable. Now, wargaming can put people off just because it's got the word game in the title. So like, why would I ever consider doing a war game? So something. So we can just call it red teaming instead. The idea of nominating a small group of people to come and challenge our idea, to challenge our way of doing things, officially give them like a different hat and says, you are not only allowed to challenge, but we're actually actively asking you to challenge our existing way of thinking, is a powerful way of getting like different perspectives. As long as like the organization is actually happy to listen to a red team. Oftentimes I've seen red teams stood up, give a view, and the organization is just like, that view is different to what we're thinking already, which is kind of the point. But then, actually accepting that and doing something different can lead to some managers reacting with coiled horror. So, as always, you still need good leadership to buy into these ideas to do them effectively. It's very interesting to see what a group of experts in your area does if you put them into a team and say, break it, like break our idea open. But it's super, super interesting to do it with a group of people who aren't experts, because then, experts still are slightly tied to the assumptions of their professions. They're still slightly tied to the way of acceptably doing things. Like if you have somebody who has no idea how things are supposed to work, then they'll come up with completely different ideas, which might be equally valid about why your idea is, not as good as it could be. Yes, if wargaming as a huge thing is a bit too much and is unpalatable, then red teaming is something if you want to get your ideas challenged in the workplace, that I encourage you guys to kind of explore. Now, I've said a little bit about educational value. So all of the stuff I've just said is about kind of challenging ideas, kind of coming up with them, and kind of this really big active idea space. But sometimes, if you've got something really kind of chunky that you just want people to understand, you can just create a game about it, make people play through that game, and they'll come away with an understanding of it. So this picture here is when I did a satellite wargame at one of the past Connections conferences, which are the big UK kind of wargaming conferences that we have once a year. And with this satellite game, I now have an understanding of satellite orbits. I don't know what I'm going to do with that information. Like, I don't know exactly what workplace environment where knowing the Mion orbit is going to be beneficial. But because I played through that game, it has stuck with me far more than reading any kind of policy paper on satellites would. Because I was actively having to go through and use my brain to work out which orbits to kind of do the challenges in the game. So I came away with understanding quite advanced concepts of how satellites move, just because I played a game which had really nice satellite counters. I was like, look at that satellite, it's plastic, it looks nice, I want to get involved. And now I know how to spy on people from space. Strange, but educational value is effective. This is also for another presentation. Some example games that we've got. So these are games that the UK government has explored. It is kind of fairly in the public knowledge that these have been run through. On the left, we've got kind of flood defense and things. So an example of that kind of more humanitarian crisis that you're trying to solve. And on the right are genuine problems that we never thought we'd have to solve. When we have a head of state from a different nation that is a powerful ally of us coming across, and a lot of our people have got political issues they have with him, and they're going to fly a giant baby balloon potentially with him above his convoy, which might upset him greatly, and he is known to make decisions that we don't like when he's upset. What do you do? How do you encounter that problem? There's no training for this. Actually wargaming these really bizarre situations is an effective way of actually trying to get our heads around what you'd even do in the first place. That means when the actual situation happens, you've got a plan and you can kind of go through it. And then you can do this for a lot of different things. You can make them very abstract. So this is an example of going and having a look at challenges we as a country are impacted by the American presidential result. So understanding a bit more about that is very important. But sometimes it's very easy to just take all your names off, because you don't want to be seen to be wargaming your allies election. But still important to understand what the likely impacts of it are going to be and exactly how it's going to play out. So I've just talked for half an hour about why you'd wargame in a workplace, but I think the brief that I was given for this was how you would become a wargamer in a workplace. So now I've kind of made the sales pitch about why it might be a useful skill. And assuming that you guys have an interest in this kind of stuff because you're at a conference dedicated to it, if you want to be a professional wargamer, how would you do it? I think the first thing is it cannot be your only skill. You cannot rock up at an organization and say, I'm a wargamer, and then get a job dedicated to it. There is a fairly small cadre of people that are doing it. It's a very specialist thing. And if you want to be involved, you absolutely can aim yourself and say, I want to work in this place because it's got a good wargaming capability and I want to be involved, but you need to bring something to it. It could be kind of good digital skills. It could be good project management skills. It could be, anything, but you need to have a secondary skill set. We need, particularly in the civil service, I'm just going to speak on now, we need good event facilitators, we need kind of innovators, we need people who've got a track history with policy, we need people who have got expertise in lots and lots of different areas. Now, if you have kind of expertise and you want to have wargame on top of it, you can kind of bring that, that's very powerful, and you can probably get it into it quite easily once you're inside. But if you are applying for one of the wargaming spaces that opens up in government and just say, I play a lot of games, it's not quite enough. But game design, game design is more than just playing a game, isn't it? Actually creating games and actually kind of running through situations. Now that is the start of a road that can get you into professional wargaming. If you can show you can reliably kind of wargame out and design and run events, you can actually produce and create games instead of just playing in them, that makes you a lot more attractive as a wargamer. So yes, if you're interested in doing it professionally, very much, first step I'd advise is to get actually running your own games, actually understand how it works, and then kind of figure out how you can get value out of those games afterwards that you can share with people. And that puts you on this kind of long road. And I think game design is something we're all very passionate about here. So, I don't think that's going to be too hard to sell. So yes, network building as well. So the other thing that is really attractive to people when they're applying to be kind of wargamers is like, who do they know, and like how will they bring that kind of expertise in? Because with wargames, we're trying to explore challenges that we've never really kind of faced before in lots of different cases, and so having access to big networks of people who know different things is very handy. So yeah, if you want to be a professional wargamer, basically what I did was I went to watch this guy's like quite about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. I started kind of attending Megagames. I thought it was interesting. Then I was doing some game design on the side. So when I found a place in government that was doing wargaming, I kind of talked a little bit about that. But then I've tried to figure out exactly what value I could bring to that community. And my value was in building networks, which is where I've built the Fast Stream Wargaming Network, which is a network of about 350 people who kind of think about this in government. And then I figured out exactly how we can get kind of value out of them, how we can actually, from running a war game, like impact decisions that we're likely to make. Now that is different for every organization, but actually figuring out how you can create good learnings from running a war game makes you a very attractive candidate if you want to be working in wargaming kind of professionally. So kind of a piece of advice I was given many years ago is, if I want to do something, I need to be able to tell a story about why I want to do it and why I'm really good for that role. So, if you can think of kind of a 2-line summary of why you would be a good professional wargamer, knowing exactly what values wargaming can bring, but thinking through some of the challenges and how you'd kind of solve those challenges, then that really puts you on the road to doing it in a professional context. So, there we are. That's 40 minutes because that gives us about 15 minutes or so for questions. So, Chris, do we have any questions?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alex. I specifically like the accidental slides that made it in there. I'm sure they weren't supposed to be there.
Oh, absolutely. Creating these things on the fly,
Yeah.
particularly for a Megagame conference, is a busy kind of affair.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've got a couple of questions for you, but if anybody else has questions, please do paste them in or put them into the chat, in the Zoom chat or in the Zoom Q&A, and we'll go to them next. Right, okay, so one of mine then is, obviously, you've been involved, like you mentioned, you've set up the Wargames stream in your organisation. What Wargames have you actually been involved in running or involved in your job? What have you done? Can you tell us about?
So what Wargames have we done recently? I'm going to talk about the last 2 we ran because easy comes to the brain. Last weekend we were doing what we called the Grand Strategy Wargame, which was basically Watch the Skies, but without any of the funny stuff. So this was a member of my committee who was really passionate about exploring potential flashpoints in the next 5 to 10 years. And so it basically was a war game around the South China Sea, what was going to happen in the conflicts around that, the difference between China and America and things. So very big, very grand scale. And it was this one was kind of one to kind of get a lot of our members into the idea of wargaming at the beginning. So there was a lot of education element for us. But secondly, some of the guys who were helping run it actually had some contacts in the American Department of Defense. And so they got an ex-assistant secretary of defense down to kind of like run through the end result of the game and talk about it, which had a big kind of reputational benefit to us. So not only are we kind of showing off that we're thinking about these challenges in government, but also we're showing off to our allies, actually, our young people are kind of really crunching on with some of the bigger challenges of the day. So at the moment we have got that, we've got the learnings from it, and our big challenge now is to identify bits of government that would benefit maybe from listening to the perspectives of what happened there. So that was the Grand Strategy kind of war game that we ran last week. Now, about 3 weeks ago, I think, we worked with the University of Cambridge to wargame out kind of the European vaccine rollout that was going on. So this was to help contribute to kind of academic understandings of these situations more than it was about government decision making and policy making. But it was very handy because this vaccine rollout is a very kind of new challenge that we're facing. Countries are competing for a very limited resource that is being produced at a set rate, and then there's a lot of politics on top of it, particularly with the EU exit kind of result. And so understanding a little bit more about what was going to happen there and things was very handy. And then some of the things that came out of that kind of identified kind of challenges around the AstraZeneca vaccine and the political nature of it and things like that. And then like weeks after that, we saw the Italian export ban on their load to Australia of that vaccine. And then we saw the blood clotting kind of suspension from a number of EU nations. So a lot of the things that we were kind of testing around in that space were things that kind of ended up happening. And so the learnings we took there were very advantageous. Now, there's a lot of other stuff we're supporting, but I must say at the moment, a lot of wargaming is done in the security and defense space. So when it comes to that kind of slightly crunchier stuff, I can't really go into too many details here.
No, that's completely understandable. Thank you. Obviously, the EU are currently threatening to ban, or they're sort of not picking on, but they're saying in certain terms, the UK may stop getting the vaccine exports from themselves. So yeah, it's interesting to see that obviously they've been thinking about that before it happened, which is great. Another question here from Alex Beck. I work in the music industry, which is deeply suspicious of anything remotely like wargaming or even red teams. Despite there being many scenarios that could be wargamed in a fast-changing industry, how do you sell it, wargaming or red teaming, to people that see it as nerdy or silly or just games?
So it's much easier to sell a result than it is to sell permission to do it in the first place. So getting something done is a really effective way of then get your value out of it. So think about what's in the music industry. I don't know what kind of scenarios you're going to challenge and have to run through, but running a small project, running a small game on it, getting some value out of it, and identifying who would actually benefit from learning about that value. So if the value is like, we identify in this challenge that these 3 things are likely to happen, and identifying who could actually use that information. Once the information exists and it's written down and it's kind of in a nice presented way, then suddenly people, you can't uncreate that information, and people are curious about where it came from. They're curious about the legitimacy of it, and they kind of probably want to bring their own challenges into it, and suddenly you've got a conversation going. So it's a very hard sell to try and get someone to buy into something they've not seen before, particularly when it's completely in a different sector. Like, I've not really got any experience with music-based kind of wargaming or the challenges of the music industry, but getting it designed, even in a small prototype way, running it, and then selling that output is a really important kind of first step, particularly because it makes you think about what the output actually is, which is, I think, the most important thing in like a professional context, is that you actually need something at the end of it. You can't just run through the scenario, but you want to have like a report, or you want to have someone senior coming away with an experience, but you need to have something credible that you're aiming to achieve by doing it. And so running a prototype can really help get your head around it.
That's good, thank you. I got a question here from Jim. What do you see as the main barriers to the adoption of serious gaming or wargaming in government?
So the main barriers, I think, is that decision making in government is a very strange thing. I wouldn't say it was done in a structured and repeatable way. Everyone makes decisions in different parts of government in a very different capacity and a very different kind of method. What we're trying to do at the moment is we're trying to bring some structure to that, because we want to bring lots more people into that decision-making process. I talked a little bit about groups being brilliant. When we're looking at kind of the civil service going forward, like, we really, really, really want to get kind of new skills in, kind of new perspectives on things, and we want to be kind of making ourselves a lot more agile as an organization. But that means the actual decision-making process needs to have a little bit more structure to it. It can't just be done by the old boys in a smoky room with a cigar. But once you start making that decision-making process something that's understandable, that people kind of interact with in different ways, then wargaming fits in quite nicely. When what kind of interactions you're looking for, what kind of experiences are people looking at. Once you know how decisions are made, and once other people know, because you've been amazed in the civil service exactly how much ambiguity there is about how decisions are actually made by the people making them at the time, then you can start doing kind of interesting things to create value out of it.
Sounds like you've got a serious challenge in your hands there, but yeah, good luck. Got a question here from Max. What different sorts of mechanics have you tried in professional contexts? Are there patterns which are more useful, for example, in defense contexts versus political contexts versus other contexts?
So a lot of our mechanics are more about kind of seminars / matrix games. So kind of having a scenario. We're not worrying too much about rule sets or dice or kind of things like that. We have agreed ways of kind of solving adjudication challenges. So when two people want to do something, like how to resolve it, usually through the medium of kind of engaging kind of other members of the team in the room, or if we're agreeing that it's a matter of chance, having like one dice roll there, but we don't try and get too much into kind of like the more kind of mechanical side of wargaming at the moment. Which is really good because when we're dealing with the challenges we're facing at the moment, a lot of the things that we do are they go outside our area of expertise. So let's say we're kind of looking at hybrid warfare, so the idea of like any conflict between nations being not only military, but kind of economical and kind of digital, etc. Quickly, you're going to have someone come up with an idea, but not have an expert on that particular form of like situation in the room to kind of really model it out. So we don't try and model things out. We kind of make assumptions, make sure the assumptions are fairly accurate by people in the room. So we just say, he assumes this is happening. Like, does anyone here disagree? And if so, say now. And then we kind of resolve that as best we can. And then we kind of go onwards, because what we're trying to find out is kind of what decisions people would make after those things. So like, I think I'm thinking about when we struggled. A recent kind of design failing we had was when we were running a game and we wanted to understand how something would happen, but then the facilitator then spent an hour trying to get people to kind of explain the intricate details of what they'd move where, etc. And that kind of like detailed thing kind of isn't the point in government. Like maybe in security sector they'll be slightly more involved in like that mechanical side of things, but that can like really tie things down into an area where really we just don't have the expertise in that room to really get a good answer anyway and get into that level of detail. But making things abstract and kind of resolving it through the wisdom of the crowd has led to us opening up some very good conversations and getting some very good learnings out of it.
Awesome. Question now from Tom. When you're running a Wargame in sort of in the government, how do you get your sort of control team equivalent to help you out? Are they just volunteers, like would be in our hobby?
Yes, basically. So we all have day jobs. I think I've actually encountered probably about 10 people in government who do this like full time. But most of us will have kind of day jobs and other things. But we have networks. A lot of the stuff in government is basically like, who wants to get involved in this project? If it's outside the kind of rigid lanes that we're setting in our day jobs, and people do come and get involved. So when we were running a game last week, we had people from MOD involved, we had people from DEFRA involved, we had people who were project managers, and you had people who were private secretaries, who were basically like the people who keep the entire civil service running. Like you had people from all skill sets kind of getting involved and delivering it because they found it collectively interesting. And our control team was around 7 people or 8 people, of which about 4 of them hadn't done anything like it before. And it was a very powerful experience. A lot of different learnings came out of it. And we're still kind of figuring out like what's the best way of getting more and more people involved, because we find that once you get people involved in controlling one of those things, they absolutely buy in a way that just playing them, they don't. So yeah, usually it's a volunteer thing, but there's usually a lot of keenness to get involved.
That's cool. I mean, I guess obviously with you creating the sort of the work stream, it helps with the networking, and interested people kind of flock. They hear about it, they flock forward kind of on their own initiative. That's great. Another question from Jim: what do you think the civil service war games can do when the lessons derived from war games are ignored by the policymakers?
If you're ignored by a policymaker, that's just a very rude thing, isn't it?
It really is.
So this is part of the policymaking process, not being defined and structured and things. In some places, like no convincing argument is able to make headway, and we don't have a mechanism to like pull an emergency cord and say, we won't listen to, bring in the troops or anything like that. But realistically, like policymakers in the civil service, particularly when they're dealing with kind of the challenging like issues of tomorrow, are not on a firm footing. We're all playing in spaces where we are somewhat an expert in one way or another, and so I've never encountered a conversation with like a policy kind of lead which has kind of shut down avenues of inquiry and things. Usually on that front, any information is good information as long as you can reliably show where it came from and the process of getting it and things like that. Don't just come and say I've got assumptions and demands, but come and say with this many people, these people had this knowledge and this was the result. Then you can have a very good conversation. And yes, actually we work in government, so So a lot of kind of times when decisions are made are kind of contrary to the wisdom that we've got is because of politics. Politics happens, and then that is a constant challenge in government. But what we do find actually is that we get given credence for actually, instead of just kind of coming up to a minister and saying, we've got a proposal, and the proposal is we had a chat and we thought this was a good idea. If you come up to them and say, we wargamed this, we actually involved young people, we didn't actually involve the same 3 policy people who you always talk to, but we actually got a big crowd involved. Actually, we invited you down, Minister, because you love getting involved in this kind of stuff, and they generally kind of do. Then suddenly you've got kind of a collaborative process where they're involved in the war game at the beginning. So they kind of see the challenge. Their minds can potentially change quite readily because ministers are really quite flexible, particularly when they're involved in coming up with ideas. And then you get a lot of very powerful kind of headwind behind the outputs. Potentially too powerful. You need to be mindful of that, because if your war game is badly designed and the minister gets enthusiastic about it, you've just created yourself a little bit of trouble. But yeah, I think by involving people in war games is the best way, instead of just kind of coming up to them cold and just saying, we've thought about your policy area and we've made decisions, listen to us. So yeah, all about that spirit of collaboration.
Cool. One from me. With the way things are right now, obviously the war games you've run obviously must have been done using digital technologies like Discord and Zoom and whatever else. But do you foresee things changing when you get back into the office? Would you sort of be a hybrid of digital and in person, or would it be all in person in a room, do you think?
We'd be silly to just sack off all the digital technology that we've got. Like, it's really handy, and actually just being able to say in people's calendars, give us 2 to 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, log on and get involved, and then them doing it and that being a bespoke thing, much easier than saying, travel halfway across the country and all this kind of stuff. So logistically, fantastic. But a lot of the real value that comes out of war games that we see is about people talking to each other, people sharing ideas. That's a lot harder to do in a digital space, because when you're playing a digital kind of war game or mega game, you're talking to people in your channels if you're doing on Discord, but you're not exactly just kind of wandering around the room, kind of seeing things and kind of chatting to people and experiencing things with them. So a lot of, particularly if we're trying to run games for the purpose of bringing people together, I would be pushing to get those being done in real life. Kind of a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do with war games is kind of make people excited and motivated. Part of like working in government is challenging the challenges of tomorrow. When you're just typing away in emails 24 hours a day, that's really disheartening, because that's not it. But when you're coming into the Foreign Office and they've got a big room and they've got a big table and they've got a guy with a nice hat and he's going to be helping you, then that's something that really buys people in and kind of makes them enthusiastic. Like, there's a lot of value from doing these things with the trappings of government around you to really get people kind of like motivated and raring to go to face the challenges we've got to face as a country.
Awesome. Okay, we'll make this the last question, I think, because I know you've got to go off and help with Watch the Skies in a few minutes. What plans do you have for the wargaming in civil service in the future? What do you what's on your roster of things to do?
So the wargame community in the civil service is very scattered. There's lots of people who like play around with it. There's a couple of big kind of like amateur groupings that kind of come together occasionally to chat about it, but it's basically a lot of people who know each other who kind of do it with each other. But like, I don't think people really like that as a kind of current state of affairs. So what I'm trying to do with my network is trying to bring lots of kind of new faces into this, new ideas, people who've never encountered it before. Because like, I think it's just like with mega games, it's nice to have more people coming to your games, isn't it? It's nice to have more control players floating about. It's nice to have kind of a larger community to be doing these big community events with. And also, once you have more people buying into it, then more people are using it. Once you have more people using it, then more people are seeing other teams use it. It builds upon itself. It's a very virtuous circle. So my plans are to kind of help kind of create a pipeline of talent who can then go and support the very many different kind of war games already happening in government, run a couple ourselves, but through that kind of create a bit more of a robust network of war gamers that can go and kind of then go and drop in when we've got new challenges. And then we will be, as a government, slightly more agile and slightly more able to kind of think through the problems that we have to solve.
Yeah, the future looks bright. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, excellent presentation. And if anybody has any further questions for Alex, I know you're going off to help with Watch the Skies, as I said, but if you post them in the pub Discord channel, I'm sure, Alex, you'll be able to look at them at some point this afternoon and maybe reply. So yeah, but thank you very much for coming along. Really appreciate it, and well done.
Perfect. I just posted my Twitter, which I think we're supposed to do these days, and to chat.
Yeah.
So if anyone needs to follow and chat to me, that's the easiest way of getting me. But hopefully you guys found this slightly interesting. As always, it's just the views of one man doing one thing in a very large world. But I have enjoyed talking to you. So have a good day, guys.
Thank you very much. See you later.